100 years ago, in the year 1917, the National Democratic Revolution, which took place in Ukraine, resulted in the proclamation of Ukrainian People's Republic. It seemed that this gave Ukraine its long-awaited chance and fulfilled its dream of becoming a democratic European country.
В атмосфері хаосу, який виник на сході Європи, особливо
At that time, even in its form at the time, Ukraine was a so-called island of stability in the atmosphere of chaos, which emerged in Eastern Europe and on the territory of the Russian Empire, when the provisional Russian government basically did not hold its front in the composite of the Entente against Germany.
Навіть в тому вигляді, який був. І об'єктивно подивимося.
Let's look objectively at the situation in Eastern Europe. There was no country, no Poland, no Czechoslovakia, no Hungary. All of these territories were parts of Austria-Hungary.
Це частина Австро-Угорської імперії.
However, 3 years after these events, in the autumn of 1920, everything ended with the introduction of the communist regime in Ukraine. Today, 100 years after the revolution, we're concerned with the issues. How did it happen that the Bolsheviks, who conducted their activities mainly in industrial centers of Ukraine and had a minimal impact on the population, succeeded to build a state on the basis of communist ideology that existed for about 70 years? How was Ukrainian society, which was very little interested in the Bolshevik program of activities, infected by communist ideology? In the opinions of Ukrainian historians, there are several answers to these questions. This theory was popular throughout Europe. It is not to be supposed that it concerned only Ukraine or Soviet Russia. Communist ideology was spread throughout all of Europe. Secondly, the Bolsheviks' policy was not only conceited, but also cynical, insolent, cruel, and false. The manipulations used by the Bolsheviks to achieve their goals were not always obvious to Ukrainian politicians and the average Ukrainian citizen. Bolsheviks started fighting for Ukraine from February 1917 in a battle with participants of the Ukrainian nationalist movement. As adherents of Karl Marx, they were afraid that it could disrupt the unity of the labor class as a political power. At that time, the entire Ukrainian nation was a peasant nation. It led even to a cynical joke that the whole Ukrainian elite could be placed in one train car, and if the train crashed, all Ukrainians would lose all of their state leaders. Indeed, the Ukrainian nationalist movement was a peasant movement. To recognize the fact of the existence of the Ukrainian people was really problematic for the majority leaders of Bolshevism. One of the famous Ukrainian Bolsheviks, Mykola Skripnik, testified to the spread of such views. Ukraine did not exist as a national unity for the majority of the members of our party. But in the public speeches, the Bolsheviks supported the rights of oppressed people, cultural development, and self-government, though only to a certain extent. If this movement could cause the separation of Ukrainian working people from Russians, it can be considered bourgeois nationalism. The advantage of this approach was the fact that the Bolsheviks pretended to approve the aspirations of Ukrainians, and therefore, they deserved their support. A political official of that time and an active fighter against Ukrainianism, Volodymyr Zatonsky, told about methods of Bolshevik agitation on many occasions. To gain the authority and support of soldiers, the Bolsheviks were not even afraid to lie. They ended their speech with slogans that contradicted the Bolshevik activity, though they fostered the overthrow of the Ukrainian Central Rada. No more war. Go home. Immediately take your land. This was apropos at that time, as the Central Rada delayed the implementation of land reform. The Ukrainian Central Rada also passed a law on socialization of land, which, on the one hand, was welcomed by the peasant population of Ukraine that had returned from the front. On the other hand, the law contrasted with the Ukrainian tradition of landholding, which was widespread among Ukrainians. The majority of lands owned by large and mid-level landowners who had a peasant origin but conducted their independent business came under the provisions of the law.
Землевласників середнього класу і навіть середніх землевласників, які мали суто селянське походження.
So the development of events was a proclamation of socialization of land on the one hand and a delay in the implementation of land reform in the villages on the other hand.
А найголовніше,
It was a situation in which the distribution of land had already been declared, but nobody took any action to bring the reform to fruition.
аграрними реформами на селі, коли було декларовано розподіл землі, але фактично нічого не проводилося.
In such conditions, the Bolsheviks had all the trump cards in their hand. The Bolshevik Revolution in Petrograd was approved at the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, controlled by the Bolsheviks and their allies. They tried to use the same tactic by convoking the All-Ukrainian Congress of Soviets in Kiev in December 1917. But the majority of delegates supported the Central Rada, so the plans of the Bolsheviks to organize and carry out a revolution failed. Given this, the Bolsheviks resorted to provocation. They moved from Kiev to Kharkiv, named the Central Rada a public enemy, and proclaimed the establishment of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic on December 24, 1917. Bolshevik troops moved towards Kiev from the north and east, while the Bolsheviks incited a rebellion of workers of the arsenal plant in Kiev. The January rebellion was raised by the 5th column that was sent from Moscow and Petrograd, so the majority of people who took part in it came from the territory of Russia. That's why it was argued that the insurrection was allegedly an internal affair that involved only workers of the arsenal plant. But in reality, the situation was quite different. It was more reminiscent of the present-day situation in the Donbass region. That is, a certain number of people came to Kiev and armed the working class, and the rest of the population of Kiev, who were under the influence of the Bolsheviks, incited an anti-state rebellion while waiting for the troops under the command of General Muravyov, who were moving from the east into Ukraine. The armed rebellion was crushed by troops of the Central Rada. The Bolsheviks also reminded Ukrainians that the German-Austrian army came to Ukraine upon the invitation of the Central Rada during the reign of Hetman Petro Skoropadsky. That happened in the summer of 1918, when there was attempt of the Central Rada to provoke an anti-German, anti-Hetman uprising in Ukraine. Let us recall the Russian political power, the Communist Party of the Bolsheviks, which proclaimed the All-Ukrainian Rebellion of 1918. Everything ended with a huge venture. The renowned Bohun and Tarashcha regiments, which were formed of rebels of the Tarashcha district and other troops, were assigned to go to the territory of the Russian Federation, to a so-called neutral zone, where they would be reinforced with Russian troops. In the opinion of Ukrainian historian Hennady Yefimenko, the commander of the Russian volunteer army, Anton Denikin, operated to the benefit of the Bolsheviks. In the summer of 1919, his troops occupied a large territory of Ukraine where a military dictatorship was established. Yefimenko wrote that Denikin did not conceal his negative attitude neither towards Ukrainian statehood nor to the notion of land distribution. After his invasion, Ukrainians understood that matters would get worse, so they drew the conclusion that the only way for the survival of Ukrainian statehood was to seek a compromise with the Bolsheviks. And when in the autumn of 1919 the Ukrainian volunteer army moved to Moscow, Ukrainian intellectuals started to have grave concerns. Yevhen Chikalenko made notes about this in his diary. An independent Ukrainian state was established due to the Bolshevik uprising. It is possible that when all the Soviet leaders will die in Moscow, the Ukrainian state will also collapse. Among their slogans were all power to the Soviets, land to the peasants, plans for the workers, peace, end of the war. But the main tool of the slogans was terror. It was the terror of the strata of population, which were considered to be a hindrance in the establishment of the Bolshevik communist regime. Having established their regime in Ukraine, the Bolsheviks introduced a tough economic policy known as the policy of military communism. It included nationalization of land and industrial enterprises, compulsory labor mobilization, and expropriation of peasants' grain. The catastrophic economic situation incited the dissatisfaction of Ukrainians with the Bolshevik, and it resulted in strikes and a peasant uprising that swept all of Ukraine. It was a large-scale rebellion. Historical researchers say that the peasant war lasted from 1917 or from 1918 until Holodomor. It was called a war of all against all. Indeed, all segments of the Ukrainian population participated in this war. Having comprehended that the policy of military communism had failed, the Bolsheviks began applying another tactic. In March 1920, they proclaimed a new economic policy, NEP, that provided for market relations in the villages. Having forgotten about the horrific period of Russian intervention, Ukrainian peasants became more patient to the Bolshevik regime, which they were very suspicious of earlier. The next tactical step of the Bolsheviks to promote national interests was the introduction of the policy of Korenizatsiya, planting the roots. In April 1923, it foresaw the involvement of representatives of the local population of Soviet republics and autonomies in local governance. The policy of planting the roots had different formats in every republic. For example, it had two various aspects in Ukraine: the Ukrainianization of Ukrainians and the planting of the roots of ethnic minorities. The policy of the Ukrainianization, conducted by the Kremlin for the purpose of gaining the loyalty of the people to its own benefit, had actually quite different results. It resulted in the development of national education, culture, art, and the awakening of the national consciousness of Ukraine. The policy of Ukrainianization was seized in early 1933. Alongside this policy, the Bolsheviks began Russification. First, they sent thousands of functionaries to Ukraine to conduct the collectivization of farmlands. After that, Joseph Stalin declared that the so-called local nationalism posed a serious threat to the unity of the Soviet Union. This ultimately led to the oppression of Ukrainian culture and education. Industrialization and collectivization resulted in the consolidation of power in the hands of Moscow leaders. It meant that all the dreams and illusions of Ukrainians and success in self-government achieved in the 1920s did not have any chance for existence. Stalin tried to turn the country into an administrative unit of the USSR. Anyone who put up an obstacle to his plan was immediately exterminated. This was the so-called Great Terror of 1937 to 1938. Repressions reached such a scale that people started to believe that public enemies, spies, and saboteurs really existed. It was a result of so-called educational work, which was conducted by the Bolsheviks for 20 years. Practically from the 1920s, the Ukrainian population had already grown accustomed to the fact that every person could be turned into socially deprived individual for one reason or another. And it was only by pure chance that such a person remained in Ukraine. More often than not, they were sent to a concentration camp in Siberia. From 1934, after the killing of Kirov, the majority of the Ukrainian population was in a state of constant psychosis. It was only workers who occupied top positions in the government, wore embroidered shirts, took part in mass protests, and made speeches at conferences and congresses that kept their bags always packed, because special Kremlin agents could pay a visit to them at any moment and send them into exile to those concentration camps.
Існувала в режимі абсолютного, тотального, щоденного, щонічного масового психозу. Більш-менш відповідальні працівники, ті, що були на поверхні, ті, що щодня бігали в вишиванках по масових заходах, виступали на політінформаціях, на нарадах, на з'їздах і так далі, всі фактично мали зібрану торбу і вночі кожної ночі чекали, коли за ними прийдуть.
These were the consequences of the hope of a bright communist future. 100 years later, we can safely say that communist project for building of a great state of equal rights of nationalities was nothing but a farce. As a result of the reforms, a majority of representatives of the